I am really excited for today's video because it's taken me an absolute age to create this list. I've thought really hard about it, and I have finally come up with my 6 favourite fantasy books. And I actually made this list and then realised that 2 of the books probably fall into the YA category, and I was going to do a separate YA fantasy video. But once I'd finally got to 6, I wasn't going to start messing around. So 4 of them, can't do maths, 4 of them are kind of adult fantasy, and 2 of them are, I would probably say, new adult rather than young adult, because they do have some quite dark themes in them. But yes, let's start talking about my favourite fantasy books. As with my favourite historical fiction video, which I will link in the description box and up here if you haven't seen that one yet, I'm not going to rank these any further than just saying that these are my top 6 books. I will talk about them in alphabetical order because I am a nerd like that. The first book I'm going to talk about is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This is the first book in a duology, and it's probably no surprise to anyone who's been around here a while that this is on this list, because I talk about this book to everybody. If anyone asks me for a good entry fantasy book, then this is definitely one that I would recommend. There is a trilogy known as the Grisha trilogy, which comes before this particular duology. They are also good, but they are definitely YA, whereas I feel like this book along with Crooked Kingdom, which is the second and final book in this duology, they're a little bit more complex. The basic premise of this book is that we have a band of misfits or outcasts who are pulled together to carry out a seemingly impossible heist. They have to break into a stronghold which has never been breached before and rescue a hostage, and this hostage just also happens to be about to release some form of magical chaos on the rest of the world. And that's all I'm going to say, but it is rich in characters, it's rich in diversity, it's interesting and different, and I would highly recommend it. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is the first book in the Farseer trilogy. It's the first book in a whole series of trilogies that Robin Hobb has written based in the world of the 6 duchies, and this is where it all begins. And this is the Farseer books, or any book actually that features Fitz, is just they are just my favourite books. So the premise of this particular trilogy is that we are thrown into the world of the 6 duchies right as it is on the cusp of civil war, and with possibly the worst timing, the much loved crown prince announces that he has fathered a bastard. That bastard is called Fitz. That bastard is brought into the kingdom and is trained up to be an assassin, and that's kind of where the story begins. And we follow Fitz as he comes of age, as he discovers who he is, as he tries to find his place in this world. And that's kind of the basic premise, yet there is so much more to these stories. They are very strongly character driven. There is magic, there are dragons, there is intrigue and politics, and it's just so good. And the further that you go into the books that Robin Hobb has written and created in this world, and I think it's actually part of a wider realm called the Elderlings realm, and her books, which you might be able to just see here, I've got the Mad Ship and Ship of Destiny. They are part of the Elderlings realm. There's the Rainwild books as well, so there's a whole kind of massive world going on, but these ones are still my favourite. I love Fitz and I love the Fool, and yeah, I would highly recommend them. They are, as I said, very character driven, and I know that people have criticised Robin Hobb's writing as being quite slow because it's not rich in plot. It's definitely about the characters, but I would definitely recommend them. I think they are very good. The next book I'm going to talk about is Taliesin by Stephen Lawhead. This is essentially Stephen Lawhead's take on the myth of King Arthur set in Roman Britain, but this particular book, which begins its life way ahead of the birth of King Arthur, actually centres on the story of Atlantis. It's the first book in his Pendragon cycle. I think there are 5 books in total, and I absolutely adore them. I am pretty much a big fan of anything that Stephen Lawhead writes. There is this series and his trilogy on Robin Hood, which I also really enjoy. But yeah, I was actually talking to the kids the other day, and we were talking about myths and legends, and one of them brought up the story of King Arthur and said, oh, obviously it's not real. And James piped up, it's not real, but we believe every word that Stephen Lawhead has ever written about him. So that just about tells you how much I love these books. There is this strong Celtic undercurrent in a lot of what Stephen Lawhead writes, particularly in this series, and I'm just so here for it. I'm actually thinking that I need to reread these books because it's been about 10 or 12 years since I've read them, and I just adore them. I know that myth retelling and especially like King Arthur retellings are not for everybody, but this book is life for me. It's just, the whole series is life. It's amazing and I highly recommend it. Just read it. Then a book which probably needs very little explanation, and that is A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. Thanks to the TV series, I think that you'd have to have been living under a rock to not know what these books are about. But again, the particular thing that I like about these books is how character driven they are. I mean, in terms of plot, George R. R. Martin has it all. It's rich, it's well thought through, it's complex, it's political, it's character driven. There is so much going on that it can be a little bit overwhelming at times, and each book is about that big, and of course he hasn't finished writing them all yet, but oh my word, I love these books. I'm actually doing a reread right now of these books, and I'd forgotten how completely absorbing they can be and how I can just tune everything else out because I get totally swept up and caught up in the world that George R. R. Martin has created. And again, there is dragons, there's magic, there's just so much to take in and absorb, and it's amazing. I often also get asked about these books, about whether they're worth reading, whether you should just stick to the TV show, and I would definitely recommend them. They're fast-paced, they're complex, they're interesting, they're unique and creative, and I absolutely rate them. Next up we have The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn trilogy. It's the first series of books by Brandon Sanderson that I read, and what an introduction to the writing of Brandon Sanderson. He is by far a very masterful storyteller, and these books absolutely blew my mind. And if that's not high praise enough, I don't know what is. So basically, these books begin their life with the premise, what if the Dark Lord won? For the past 1,000 years, the bad guy has basically been ruling over this world, and then you have a band of misfits who come together and decide that enough is enough, and they are going to overthrow the Dark Lord. The magic system in this is really interesting. It's to do with different metals. If you can ingest and use one metal, you are known as a misting, but if you can ingest multiple metals and use the powers that they give you, you are a Mistborn. And our Mistborn in this story is a young ragtag girl called Vin, who's kind of pushed into the middle of all of this drama and upheaval that is going on, and it's just so good. I think for me, I read the first book and I was really impressed. I read the second book and I thought, I read the third book and I really wasn't convinced until I got to the end and realised that when everything fell into place, it had just been done so masterfully, and I had not seen any of it coming, and it was just really good. And it was definitely the finale of the third book that blew my mind and convinced me that this was a good series. So if you've read the first one, or even the first and second one, and you're not convinced, keep going until the end, because for me, this series was definitely a slow burner. I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it until I got to the end and realised just how clever Brandon Sanderson was, and that really sold it for me. So yeah, another one on my recommendations list. Then the final book I'm going to talk about today is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is the story of a young man called Laszlo Strange, who has spent his whole life obsessively discovering everything he can about a city that has been lost for centuries, known as Weep, and it has been basically obliterated from the minds and memories of everybody, so much so that Weep isn't even its real name. Nobody knows what it was originally called, and one day Laszlo is given the opportunity opportunity to travel with a band of strangers to the city of Weep, and of course, because of his obsession, he cannot pass up this opportunity, and what he uncovers when he gets there is just unlike anything he could possibly have imagined. And I'm pretty sure I said this when I wrapped up my review of this book, but it wasn't so much the character of Laszlo that captured my interest when I was reading this book, and I actually probably could pass on the character of Laszlo. It was the kind of side characters that Laini Taylor created, in particular Sarai, that just had me hooked, and I just thought the concept was really interesting and unique. I really found myself rooting for some of the characters who lived in Weep, and it's not often that a fantasy book particularly will evoke a deep emotional connection in me, but I really felt that happening with this book. And I actually haven't read the second one. I think it's Muse of Nightmares, but I'm desperate to, because yeah, I just think if it's anything like this one, it's going to be so magical and so enchanting and so this was just a really gorgeous book in the end, and I would highly recommend it. So there you go, they are my 6 favourite fantasy books of the moment. Do let me know if you've read any of the ones I mentioned. Let me know some of your favourite fantasy books, because I always love recommendations. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to give me the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and I will see you all soon.